The China Trap: How the world's biggest economy is eating itself. China has done something no country in history has ever done so quick. In less than 50 years, it went from one of the poorest nations on Earth to the world's second largest economy. It built cities from scratch in a decade. It manufactured everything and made it cheaper than anyone thought possible. It turned a country where famine was still a living memory into a global superpower that the entire world depends on. But here's the secret you barely find anyone talking about. The same machine that built all of that is now running out of road. Not because China stopped growing, not because the factories slowed down, but because the model that created the miracle has a flaw built directly into its foundation, and that flaw has been compounding quietly for years. The world's most powerful manufacturing economy is trapped, and the trap was not set by its enemies. It was built by its own success. To understand the trap, you have to understand how the miracle was built in the first place. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping made an announcement that broke one of the foundational rules of Chinese communism. Getting rich, he told the party, was not a betrayal of socialist values. It was patriotic. With that single shift, he unleashed one of the fastest economic transformations in recorded history. Foreign capital flooded in. Factories rose overnight. A fishing town called Shenzhen, with a population of 30,000 people, became a metropolis of millions within 2 decades. Every province watched and copied the model. Every local government borrowed to build roads, power plants, industrial parks, all designed to attract manufacturers and generate output. By the early 2000s, China was not just growing. It was consuming the world's demand for steel, coal, copper, and oil simultaneously. Western companies did not resist. They participated. If something could be manufactured, it would eventually be made in China. The economics were simply too compelling to ignore. But underneath the growth was an incentive structure with a fatal flaw. Every level of system competed on price. Local governments cut land costs, slashed taxes, and suppressed wages to attract factories. Factories cut margins, quality, and profits to underbid each other. The measure of success was not sustainability. It was output, not profit. Output. For a while, the sheer scale of the machine made the flaw invisible. Workers poured in from the countryside by the millions, willing to work 12-hour shifts for wages that Western competitors could not touch. The ports never stopped. The factories never darkened. Western consumers received something that felt like a miracle: cheap goods, stable prices, abundance without inflation. China got rich, and then somewhere between the 100th steel mill and the 1000th industrial park, the miracle quietly became an addiction. By 2015, China's steel production capacity alone exceeded the rest of the world combined. Read that again. One country, more steel capacity than every other nation on Earth put together. And demand was nowhere near enough to absorb it. Prices began falling, not because of innovation, not because of efficiency gains, but because of desperation. Factories did not slow down when profits disappeared. They accelerated, believing that volume could compensate for loss. It could not. This is the moment economists began using a word borrowed from the social sciences to describe what was happening industrially: involution. Involution is competition that has stopped being about progress and started being about survival. It is what happens when an industry produces more than the market can absorb, when every competitor slashes prices to stay alive, and when the only weapon left is how low you're willing to go. It is a race to the bottom with no finish line and no winner. China has been running that race across its entire industrial economy for the better part of a decade. Solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries, semiconductors, shipbuilding. In every one of these sectors that represent not yesterday's economy but tomorrow's dozens of firms, many of them state-backed, flooded markets with identical products and competed almost exclusively on price. Margins vanished. Profits collapsed. In the first half of 2024 alone, China's industrial profits fell by over 20%. That happened despite exports staying strong. Factories were moving more goods than at any point in history, and earning less from each of them than ever before. Cheap abundance had become its own kind of poverty. Here's where it gets complicated, because not all of this is accidental. China's government has spent decades mastering what could be called weaponized efficiency, using state subsidies to keep strategic industries alive long enough to eliminate foreign competition entirely. The logic is calculated and ruthless. Flood a market with state-backed production, sell below cost for years if necessary. Watch as Western competitors, constrained by private shareholders demanding quarterly returns, fold and exit. Wait until the global supply chain depends on Chinese production. Then do what monopolies have always done. This playbook is not new. China ran it with steel, with rare earth metals, with shipbuilding. It underpriced the world until the world had no other option but to buy Chinese. And now it is running the same play in the industries that will define the next 50 years. Lithium batteries, photovoltaic cells, electric drivetrains. The physical infrastructure of the energy transition. In theory, it is a strategy of extraordinary ambition. Lose money today to own the future tomorrow. In practice, it's becoming a trap of its own making. Because when every sector expects the state to absorb its losses indefinitely, firms stop competing on innovation and start competing on subsidies. When local governments are judged on output rather than profitability, they keep factories running that should have closed years ago. When banks are pressured to keep lending to state-backed enterprises regardless of returns, bad debt accumulates silently until it cannot be hidden. Every yuan spent propping up an uncompetitive factory today is borrowed from tomorrow's stability. And at some point, tomorrow arrives. The deeper problem is political, not economic, and it may be the hardest one to solve. China's growth model is not just an economic strategy. It is the foundation of the Communist Party's legitimacy. The social contract that has held the country together through 40 years of transformation has one essential clause: deliver rising prosperity, and the people will accept the arrangement. It worked spectacularly when growth translated into rising incomes, expanding opportunity, and visible improvement in living standards. It is starting to break down when growth translates into cheaper goods but stagnant wages. Local governments need factories running to service the debt they took on to build those factories. State banks need those factories borrowing to justify their balance sheets. The central government needs all of them producing to maintain the appearance of full employment. Every part of the chain depends on every other part continuing to move. If any link stops, the pressure falls immediately on the links around it. So no one stops, even when the numbers no longer make sense, even when profits are gone and the only thing still growing is the debt. This is the logic of a system that has made production synonymous with legitimacy. Building another factory is not just an economic decision in China. It is a political statement. It is proof that the system is still working. And in a system where proof of motion substitutes for evidence of progress, the machine cannot be allowed to slow down, regardless of what slowing down would actually cost. Beijing's leaders understand the diagnosis. They've been talking about rebalancing the economy, shifting from investment and exports toward domestic consumption for over a decade. The speeches are clear. The policy documents are detailed. The intentions are genuine. But the incentives embedded in every provincial government, every state bank, every local Communist Party official point in exactly the opposite direction. It is, as one analyst put it, like trying to diet while the kitchen keeps cooking. What makes this particular trap so historically significant is that China did not invent it. Britain's coal industry once dominated global markets with such ruthless efficiency that British miners themselves could not earn a living wage from it. The solution was empire, captive colonial markets forced to absorb surplus production. Japan's economic miracle of the 1980s hit the same wall. Overcapacity, falling prices, an aging population that stopped consuming, and a decade of stagnation that followed. Roman estates, worked by enslaved labor, flooded the Mediterranean grain market so thoroughly that the small farmers who formed the backbone of the Republic were bankrupted. Rome fed itself into collapse. Every empire that has mastered efficiency has eventually faced the same test. Can it stop optimizing long enough to survive? The answer, historically, is almost always no. Not because the leaders did not see the problem, but because the system they had built made stopping more dangerous than continuing. China's overcapacity in solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles produces an irony almost too sharp to describe. These are the exact goods the rest of the world needs to complete the energy transition. Chinese manufacturing has made solar power the cheapest form of electricity generation in human history. It has driven the cost of electric vehicle batteries down by over 90% in a decade. By any measure, this is an extraordinary contribution to a global problem. But when the companies producing these goods are selling below cost, when profits have vanished, when dozens of manufacturers are going bankrupt and the survivors only persist because state subsidies mask their insolvency, the contribution becomes unstable. The rest of the world gets cheaper technology in the short term at the cost of China's own financial integrity. And a global supply chain built on a foundation of subsidized loss is not a supply chain the world can rely on. Cheap abundance becomes a trap not when it fails to create wealth. It becomes a trap when it destroys the motivation and the financial capacity to create more. China's problem is not that it produces too little. It is that it cannot produce profitably. It has mastered the mechanics of output and lost the balance that makes output meaningful. It can flood the world with goods, but cannot generate enough domestic demand to make the flooding sustainable. It has built an economy so efficient at making things cheaper that it has made profitability structurally difficult across entire industries. The force that built China's power, relentless competition on price, now ensures that no one inside the system can rest long enough to stay profitable. That is the China trap. Not a foreign adversary, not a trade war, not sanctions or technology restrictions, though those things add pressure. The trap is internal. It is a growth model that worked so well for so long that the system became dependent on it, and now cannot function without the very thing that is hollowing it out. When growth becomes identity, when production replaces purpose, when the only measure of progress is how much cheaper you can make something the world already has too much of, that is not development. That is involution on a civilization scale. And the most expensive lesson any empire ever learns is that there's nothing more costly than being too cheap. If this changed how you think about economic power, make sure to subscribe to our channel. It helps more people find this video. And if you thought this was interesting, wait until you see this next.